My name is Fran Fabrizio. I'm from the University of Minnesota's Minnesota Population Center, and I'm here to talk to you about rebooting the team. And I want to jump right in and get started with an admission and disclaimer that this is not a talk that was designed to be about team scalability. And so you're probably asking, then why am I here? So I'm going to go through that pretty quickly so we can get into the meat of this thing. So Minnesota Population Center. Quick context, we're the world's largest producer and disseminator of census and demographic data. So despite the name, we're not focused on Minnesota. We've got data from 70 plus countries. We go back, I think, as far as 1787, so 230 plus years, and 1.1 billion person records, which if you're keeping score is about roughly what Facebook has, although most of ours are dead. So we have that disadvantage. But So we have this data, and what we do with it is we first of all, a lot of times we go and find it in dusty archives in African countries on moldy tapes and things like that. But we bring it in, we ingest it, we do a lot of quality control on it. We link it to each other through the dimensions of time, so across the years and across the different geographies, so that they can be comparable across those things. We also link it to other forms of heterogeneous data like political boundaries, which also change through time, so that's a fun challenge, and satellite data, environmental data, raster, pixelized images on a global scale. And we link all this data together and we disseminate it to researchers around the world, policymakers, journalists, so that they can ask questions that cut across these heterogeneous sets of data in ways that were very hard to do previous to our work. So that's what we do at the MPC. I joined as the IT director about 2 years ago. And when I joined, there was a conversation going on that kind of started quietly, but soon grew to a rousing chorus of this idea that maybe our dev team was in a rut. What do we mean by a rut? So there was a qualitative difference in the feel of what it was like to come to work. We were having issues with morale being low, stress was rising, we were finding ourselves in more conflict with management and customers than we were accustomed to. We felt that things that used to be easy to do were getting hard to do. We were feeling that we were starting to be isolated into silos where we weren't interacting with each other across the team as much as we used to. And it just was starting to not be very much fun to come to work. Now, this isn't to say that we weren't still producing a lot of work, and we certainly had about a dozen developers, all of which were very dedicated to the job, very talented, unusually senior for an IT organization, lots and lots of years of experience. And so it wasn't that we were a total train wreck, we were just in a rut. And so being engineers, we very quickly got to the topic of, well, all right, how do we get out of this rut? And again, that's a conversation that started quietly and slowly started to build. And an interesting thing that happened is that before long, this actually turned into one of our real projects. We, alongside all the other daily work we were doing, we were having a conversation about debugging this wetware system that was ourselves, and started to have specific meetings to talk about specific aspects of that. And we started to engage management and even our customers, which in our case are the researchers that sit 30 feet away from us, so we have easy access to them. And it turned into a formal sort of effort that started to play out over the course of a year, which is why the subtitle of the talk is Lessons Learned in an Introspective Year. And so as these conversations progressed and we started to engage more deeply on these topics, we had a lot of insight. And eventually we turned this insight about how we were working together as a team, what motivated us as individuals, how we were engaging with our management, with our customers, how management viewed us. That was a big part of the conversation. We eventually learned enough that we kind of started to form a plan of action that we hoped would correct our course. And we started to sort of slowly meter out some of the changes that we had come up with and some of the ideas that we wanted to explore, and lo and behold, it seemed like it started to work. We were starting to feel better about coming to work. We were a little bit more energized. Stress levels were going down. The team had sort of felt like things had stabilized. Our customers were happy with what we were putting out. We were happy with what we were putting out. We were becoming less of a source of drama for management, which is always a good thing, so they can go worry about other things. And felt like we had started to make some real progress here. And certainly we don't feel like we've arrived at this point. We're still deep in the thick of this and a lot of very steep looking mountains to go and climb still, but we're feeling more optimistic about the future and feel like we're heading in the right direction. And eventually, after doing this, we thought, well, you know, this wetware systems debugging thing that we've been doing for a year almost accidentally was kind of an interesting process, and it was challenging, and at times it was awkward, and we're dealing with, you know, parts of our skill sets that we don't deal with every day when we're talking about these wetware skills. And so maybe there's a kernel of something in here that we should be sharing with the world, because dev teams probably ought to be doing this more than we do. And so a couple of us eventually started to put together a talk that turned into a presentation at OSCON this summer, and that kind of brings us up to the current event. So while I was putting the finishing touches on that talk for OSCON, one of the Surge conference organizers contacted me and said, we've come across your abstract, it looks interesting. Do you think that this would be something that would be relevant at Surge, because we're doing this organizational scalability track? And I said, well, you know, that's an interesting question. It's not the way we've been approaching it. We're viewing it as a more general team dynamics and organizational dynamics problem, but certainly a lot of the pressures on us were because we were growing and our world was getting more complex, and the number of projects we were trying to tackle was growing. So let me think about that. So I went on one of my pondering walks. You can see I'm very constrained here, but I'm trying to do one even as I talk. So one of the cool things about the MPC is our front yard is the Mississippi River. So, and we're on the west bank of campus, and most of the rest of campus is on the east bank. And so I'm often walking across this bridge over the Mississippi River, which is just kind of a cool part of my day. So I took my pondering walk. I started walking across the river and thinking about this idea of the experience that we've had, the process we've gone through, is this universally applicable to all of you who are in different organizations, in different contexts, at different scales? And totally accidentally, this turns out to be a really great place in the universe to think about that problem, because from this point in the world, if you go a couple hundred miles upstream, you come to a place in northern Minnesota called Lake Itasca. And Lake Itasca is famous because it's where the Mississippi River starts. That's the Mississippi River. So obviously that's the Mississippi River at a far different scale than the one I'm seeing every day on campus. And similarly, if you go 100 miles downstream from where I'm standing on campus, you come to Lake Pepin, famous for, that's where water skiing was invented. But Lake Pepin is actually the Mississippi River. It's a natural point in the geography where it spreads to the Mississippi River's widest point anywhere on its journey, which is over 2 miles wide. So if you want to think about scalability, and if you'll indulge me, and this is quite the logical leap here, but we're going to use this as a metaphor for organizational scalability. It's a good place to think about that, because you have the Mississippi River at these three very different scales that are seemingly not at all alike. And if I hadn't just told you, I doubt anyone in the room would look at those three pictures and say, oh yeah, those are all the Mississippi River. So similarly, do you have anything in your organizations and what you're trying to tackle with your teams that resonates with me? Or am I one of these pictures and you're one of the other two pictures, and really this is going to be hard to cross over that gap and share things with you that'll resonate with you? And so the interesting thing to think about is, even though these are at three very different scales, the dynamic process that's at work here is pretty much the exact same thing, right? You've got water flowing over earth, creating erosion, carving out a channel, seeking the easiest way to get to the lowest possible point. And yes, it's happening at a far greater scale on the right-hand side than the left, but if you dig down into it, all the interactions are exactly the same. They're human scale, right? They're people interacting with people through conversations, through processes and tools, but it's usually one-to-one or one-to-small many interactions, and the scalability portion of that is just you've got lots of those. So if we can focus on how one of those works, then scale it out to how n of those work, then you should be able to have a deeper understanding of how your team is interacting with one another, even at great scale. And so my gamble I'm going to take today is that my experience in my group with my 12 people in my context is going to resonate with you in some way, despite your very different likely circumstances that you're dealing with. So that's the gamble I'm taking. That's why I'm here at Surge, and I hope that proves to be the case. So we're going to talk about why we need this thing called a reboot, and I'll define that for you in a minute. How we get from this gut feeling that something is wrong with our team, we're in a rut, to specific symptoms that you can latch onto and talk about and explore. The collaborative process we used to get down to the root causes of those things, and then ultimately leveraging that to build consensus for change and then enacting the change. And the obligatory where we are now, what we learned in Q&A. So that's a huge topic, and I've got 40-something minutes left, so it's going to be a quick flyby. But hopefully it'll be a good introduction for you and a good case study of where we've been over the last year. So I want you to take away not the specifics of what we did, because that's very specific to my environment, but the way that we approached it, the techniques for having the conversation, some of the tools we developed, spark some ideas, and you go home and you'll have some homework here about how you translate what we're thinking about and talking about here and apply it to your own team. So it's more of a design pattern than anything else. So what's a reboot? So my definition of a reboot is a conscious decision to engage in deeper, more radical change than we do every day. So of course we're always iterating, we're always changing, but a reboot is something different. A reboot goes deeper into your organization, into your team. It typically impacts the way your team is structured, the processes that you're using to push work through your team and through your organization, and the way you're communicating with each other. Hopefully we're not changing these things every day. Why? Because these things are expensive to do. They're disruptive, they're costly, they're tricky to implement correctly, so we don't want to do this every day, but sometimes we find ourselves in a position that we need a reboot. So ideally, you want to stay down here on the far left side of the dev team power meter, right? So if you're clicking on all cylinders, right, you're shipping great code, it's on time, everybody feels engaged, everybody feels like they're contributing, and your team feels like it's greater than the sum of its parts, right? You've maxed out the dev team power meter, and that's an awesome feeling, right? Teams that are in that spot, there's a lot of communication, it's happening all the time, it's very productive, it's very focused, your management is off focusing on other problems because you're clicking on all cylinders, your customers are happy with what you're shipping, and you're taking pride in your work, and it feels awesome to be in that spot. And if you work in an enlightened organization, as I put it here, then you keep the needle at 100% because you're constantly monitoring your environment for changes that are coming your way, and you're staying ahead of them by reacting proactively rather than reactively, and incrementing gracefully over time. So how many of us are always in that spot, right? Shocking, right? None of us. So there's very few enlightened organizations in the world. Most of the rest of us are experiencing that needle sliding to the right from time to time. And why does it do that? Well, it's because our environment's changing and we're not reacting fast enough to it, right? And that could be for any number of reasons, but from the context of this conference, times of great team scaling issues is often a time when that needle starts sliding to the right, because scaling puts pressure on your team communication, the tools that you use, and the work processes that you have. And ultimately, when you scale, you have to invest a lot more trust in others. And that's a hard chasm to get over sometimes. So you have these communication process and trust issues, which start to eat at the efficiency and effectiveness of your team, right? And by the time you realize there's a problem, and that there's consensus built for something to be done, it's often too much to just sort of kind of do it day by day. You have to stop, take a step back, and do something more drastic, right? Why do most of our organizations end up here? Well, because when the meter's over here on the left, it's really, really hard to convince anyone that you need to have change, right? Things are going perfectly, that's why we need to change, and you'll just get head scratching. It's really hard to stay ahead of that curve. So most of the rest of us have to deal with these things that I call reboots. So these things are hard. Wetware systems are much, much harder than software or hardware systems because wetware, as I say here, wonderfully messily analog, right? We're non-deterministic, we don't act predictably, there's emotions involved and personalities, and so to do these kinds of changes are a lot more costly and disruptive than software or hardware changes, and so you really don't want to do them unless you have to. And the other part that makes this tricky is that because we don't do this every day, an engineer's toolbox usually has really good software and hardware analytical type skills, but when we get to the things about touchy-feely feelings and interacting with people and respect and how interactions make us feel, we're not as good at talking about or working on those sorts of things. And so we're exercising a skill set that might be a little bit less well-refined or a little rusty, and so that leads to unpredictable effects. So as the dev manager, and I'm telling you this story from my perspective, but everybody has a role to play in a reboot, but from my perspective, the dev manager's mission is, okay, you've gotten over this leap of, there's consensus now that you're in a rut and you need to make change, right? But you don't know exactly what it is that's wrong. why it started to be wrong or how you get out of it yet, but of course everybody's looking at you to fix that. And so how do you get to the what's, whys, and hows? I call the process of doing that organizational debugging. So let's take a side step and say you're debugging a web app that's running slowly, right? So what you're going to do if you're trying to fix that problem is you're going to go look at your web server logs. You're going to look at your session logs. You might look at what the OS is doing with I/O or network traffic. You'll go look at what your database is doing. Whatever the meaningful components are, you're going to go basically pull all of those and get their feedback for what they're seeing. And then you're going to look for a pattern through that and try to come to a root cause that you can actually fix. So organizational debugging, same exact thing. No magic here. You're going to get your stakeholder views and observe the symptoms and the behaviors that are happening in your workplace. You're going to distill that into some broad themes that you can kind of latch onto and dig into to your root causes. And I'll talk about how we did all this. And then, of course, the ultimate goal is execute action plans to fix the root causes of what's ailing your team. In picture form, you start with very concrete things. You've got symptoms in your environment that are broken, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. And just like in healthcare, you really don't want to treat the symptom, you want to treat the underlying cause, so we have to go over this hump of, all right, we've got all the symptoms, what are the themes, how do they group together, how are they related, what are the underlying root causes that we really want to treat so that we have lasting change, and then what's the actions that we're going to put in place to do that. And somewhere on that curve, it doesn't have to be where I have it, but there's a decision point where you say, this feels more fundamental than I can just enact as part of my daily part of being a manager and running a dev team, that we might need to step back here and do something a little bit more disruptive. So at every point on this, at some point on this curve, every one of us is going to come to a determination that, okay, we need to either jump off the cliff and do the reboot, or we're going to do this a little bit more incrementally. So at the last time I gave this talk, I heard an interesting comment on the way out. Somebody who didn't like my talk said, they should have just called this managing the team, because I don't see how it's any different. And so I didn't get a chance to catch up with him, but my response would have been, it is and it isn't. It's much more amplified than what you're doing every day, managing your team. We're talking about more disruptive changes like structural changes or communication process changes. We're talking about it's going to be much more intentional, take a lot more of people's time to work through this, right? So it's much more of a commitment of resources and time and energy. And maybe a good way to phrase it is, your everyday job is like taking your car in for an oil change, maintenance and tuning to keep the team running well. But if you crack the axle on your car, it's a lot more disruptive. And so you have to actually go into repair mode. And that's kind of how I view a reboot as being different than the normal management job. And because of that, you have to approach it differently, right? The risks are a lot higher here and the stakes are a lot higher. So there's some sort of guidelines as we're going through this reboot that I want people to keep in mind. Number one, respect the day job. The day job doesn't end when you decide that you all want to do this big wetware systems debugging and rejiggering. So do it slowly, do it over time. It also takes time for people to absorb this kind of change. So make sure that you're not putting undue burden and undue stress on people from getting their day jobs done. That's the last thing you want to do. And change is scary, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt will be generated through this process. And so to combat that, be consistent. Just make sure that what you're saying to your team is consistent over time and that you're doing what you're saying. Make sure that you're over-communicating. There's no such thing as too much communication in a reboot. And check in with them often. Okay, you're gonna be further ahead in the mental process of absorbing it than everybody else, so you need to make sure that you slow down and give them a chance to catch up. You're a facilitator in the process. We're all natural problem solvers, being engineers. But ultimately, you don't have the answers to this problem. You can just bring together the people who do. So remember that and be humble about that. And that leads me to the last point, which is the one thing I want you to remember if there's nothing else today that you remember. When you're doing this kind of wetware change in your organization, humility, respect, and trust, or HEART, this is a concept from the book Team Geek. It's essential. Okay, so why is it essential? Because when you do it correctly and with humility, respect, and trust as you're interacting with your team and the rest of the organization, you're going to be sort of subconsciously generating buy-in, momentum for change, shared ownership of the process as you go along. And if you don't do it, and I've certainly stepped in this pothole a couple of times myself in our process, you produce resentment and friction, which of course is going to work against you actually implementing successful org change. Okay? So I want to dive down into the steps of the process as deeply as I can go given the amount of time we have, and talk about first, how do you observe the symptoms of your team at the start of a reboot. So remember, this generally starts as a gut feeling. Just like when you're sick, you don't wake up one day and say, oh, I've got the flu. You start to feel a little bit worse and a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And only by eventually gathering up the symptoms and linking them together do you get to a diagnosis. So to start that, literally it's very simple. Just start writing down all the symptoms that you encounter in your daily job that sort of tug at you and say something's not quite right here. And then when you're done with your list, put on your facilitator hat and go get that kind of feedback from all of your other stakeholders. Now there's a good way and a bad way to do this. It's not an interview, it's not a heavyweight process. It's just be a colleague, have conversations, do all the regular management stuff that you do. These are questions that I hope if you are a dev manager, you're asking all the time. And if you're managed by a dev manager, someone's asking you all the time, right? How's your week going? What are your biggest pain points? What's the most important things for us to be working on? So it's not, and some other questions here, but it's not that you're doing anything different. It's that you're processing what you're hearing more mindfully. Okay, so if you have a conversation about someone's week, well, I spent the first half of the week setting up my dev environment, and then after that I had to put out a lot of fires, and then by the time I had breathing room, it was Friday, and I couldn't find, who did I say here, Mark, so I didn't do any new feature development on my main project. And by the way, speaking of my project, have you heard from the product team? Because I don't know if I'm supposed to be working on the UI first or that query optimization, right? So there's two ways to respond to that. Yeah, that sucks, and you keep drinking your coffee, or be more mindful about it and realize that a whole bunch of symptoms of organizational dysfunction have jumped out in that conversation, okay? And you don't need to say to the person, I'm going to write down the 5 symptoms. Just when you go back to your desk, think about it, take some time, and process it. Avoid this. Don't ask the question, what do you think is wrong with the team? Okay, first of all, alarm bells go off, right? Like, nobody ever wants to have to deal with all that kind of negative energy and think about what's wrong with the team. But the more interesting thing that happens is people will make up shit to tell you what's wrong with the team. Why is that? Well, you're the manager. You're asking someone for their opinion. They feel like they should say something intelligent. So they will literally think of things to tell you that are wrong that aren't really bothering them that much. I had this happen to me like 3 or 4 times, and it was a really interesting lesson to learn. The other thing to do is don't dive into the solutions yet, right? Remember, we don't want to treat the symptoms. People will want to treat the symptoms because they're usually easier to treat. And it's fine to talk about that a little bit, but really make sure you don't go too deep into those weeds. And don't go too deep in general, right? This shouldn't feel heavyweight. This should feel like I'm having a conversation around the coffee machine, or we're out to lunch. It should feel casual and exactly what you're doing every day. Okay, so here are some symptoms that I tried to pick ones that are more relevant to scaling issues. So maybe your shipping dates are slipping, right? This is a concrete thing you can observe. Maybe the build is always broken. Maybe always is a little dramatic, but maybe your build is breaking a lot. Maybe you've noticed your uptime slipping. Maybe your long-term goals are remaining long-term goals, right? That's always a fun one. If the 6-month goals are never getting any closer, that could be a problem. Your estimates are proving, your work estimates are proving to be unreliable. Maybe you're having some scaling issues there. This is an interesting one. It's too quiet. Like, people should be talking and collaborating, maybe in a workplace, maybe over digital medium, but in any case, if you notice a change in that, a qualitative change, that's an important symptom. Staff working on similar problems are not working together. This is a problem I have in a big way right now that we're trying to solve. Key pieces of information aren't getting to everyone. There's confusion about information flow. This is an obvious one. People are quitting, right? That's a pretty obvious symptom, but maybe a more subtle version of that is the sick time is spiking. Maybe people are getting really stressed out and overworked. You're expected to do 5 things at once. You've been committed to things without your knowledge. This goes on and on. R&D type work has stopped. No consensus on priorities. That's a big one. You're not communicating priorities clearly. Nobody knows what winning looks like or what done means, right? And these are going to start flying up here, right? There's a lot of symptoms, and you can read through a few of these and see if this is familiar to your environment. But deployments are messy, requirements are appearing late. I can't move code between my projects easily. People are worried about the quality of the work that they're doing. Someone goes on vacation and it's really disruptive. Huge flood of symptoms. Your job is to synthesize those into themes, right? It's hard to talk about the giant picture of symptoms. It's easier to talk about themes. So it gives you an anchor point to get started with this conversation. So starting with our big flood of symptoms, you look at a few and you say, maybe I have a theme here where I've got evidence that my teams are too siloed, right? So teams are too siloed is an abstract thing, right? You can't directly treat that. So you've gone from concrete to abstract, and we'll get over the rest of that hump here in a minute. But maybe another theme that you have in your symptoms is, here's one, our ops tools are deficient, right? So, you know, if your build's breaking and your deployments are messy and small changes are not taking, are taking longer than they should, you might have evidence that your ops tools are increasing. I'm going to do one more. So this last one that I have here is, maybe you're over-promising and under-delivering. That can be a theme of what's going wrong in your organization, right? So you're all going to have different themes, and there's going to be more than 3. But just go through this process of trying to distill down so it's not so overwhelming to talk about, and that it helps you give some anchor points to start talking about root causes, right? Because all of these 7 or 8 symptoms, however many are here, could all be traced back to potentially just 1 or 2 root causes, right? It's kind of complex interaction between these things and what's actually causing them. So some of the themes that we found during our reboot process are here on the slide, including the 3 we just talked about. Some other ones were that leadership was distracted and wasn't able to commit to pay as much attention to what was happening in the dev team as we'd like. Routine things were complicated. There was a general lack of trust in the developers, and there's a bunch more. So, you know, if you've got a dozen, if you've got 6, if you've got 20, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure that you've sort of captured the essence of what's going on with your team. Okay, so we're at the top of the curve now, and now we need to come down the right-hand side, get to root causes, and then, of course, the ultimate goal is enact change. So this is a much deeper pass, and this is why I put the decision point there. Because if you're going to engage in a reboot, this is when it gets real. This is when you're starting to have serious meetings and engaging your management for real resources and those sorts of things. So if you're going to jump off the cliff, this is a good time to decide whether or not you want to do it. So assuming we decide that we want to do it, we engage in a much deeper pass across our stakeholders, both internal to the dev team and our external folks, and start working towards, one, just building an awareness that we have these problems. That's often the first issue, particularly with management, just making them aware that there is this problem going on inside the dev team or with the org in relation to the dev team. We want to achieve consensus on root causes across the org, which will then create momentum for change, right? So I'm going to tell you a quick story about estimates. So one of the first things I had to handle was a complaint by management that customers were and our customers, again, are internal, that the researchers were telling management that IT's estimates were terrible, right? So they said, you got to get better at doing estimates, okay? And the reason I'm telling this story is because it's usually not as simple as that. You usually have to peel off some layers, to use a Shrek analogy, of the onion to get to the underlying cause. So in our case, I went and talked to the devs about this and said, management's complaining about our ability to do estimates. Can you explain to me how we've been doing that in the past? Because remember, I'm new at this point. And it turns out that we do estimates on a yearly granularity. And it's even more interesting is that we do them sometimes 6 years in advance, right? Crazy? Not in our environment. This is how higher ed works, especially research funding. You write a proposal to do a grant that will give you money for 5 years. And almost every one of those grants, the requirements are that you break out the work by year and say what you're going to do in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in 2013, I'm working on grants that say exactly what I'm going to do in 2019. Okay, it's ludicrous, right? It's a total joke, but this is what we have to do to get our funding streams. And so as I was digging down into this, so I learned this, my eyes are open, and I understand, well, okay, that's obviously not going to produce accurate estimates. I need to communicate this to the customers and to management about why that's the case, right? And we have all this talk about how environments change and anything out past 3 months is more or less a mirage. And so it turned a problem into your ability to estimate sucks to we have to do this process for the federal government that looks like estimates, but that shouldn't be the real estimating process. We need to have much more tight communication and granular estimates. And what came out of that was a quarterly planning process that we do with our researchers, which is a comfortable iteration for them, but produces actual real estimates. Like I feel pretty good about what we promised to do in a quarterly estimating planning session. So the point is, the problem was not we suck at estimates. The problem was we need more transparency and communication with our customers and management as to how development really works. And if I had just told my guys to do better estimates or did all this infrastructure around trying to measure how much our work we can do in a given unit, I would have been treating the wrong problem, right? So not so big secret. Every single one of your wetware problems is going to be a problem with communication, process, or trust. Every one of them, without fail, right? But you can't stop at we suck at communicating, because that's not actionable. Right? How do you stop sucking at communicating? Well, you need to be more specific than that. So don't stop here, even though this is going to be the intermediate discovery along every single one of your wetware problems. So to get to more specifics, you need to engage with your stakeholders, and you need to engage with them in a way that resonates with them, okay? So the dev manager, in my case, I came up through engineering, and I'm a native engineering kind of thinker, but I don't think like management, and I don't think like customers, and so I have to force myself to understand their motivations and what their unique contribution can be to the reboot process, and then meet them there at that spot, right? So having said that, I'm going to start with the dev team. That's the group I have the most influence over, and that's the group I understand best, and also that's the group I have the most direct responsibility for, so I want to start there. Now, I can talk a lot about what motivates devs. That's a really interesting topic, but it can be summarized in the phrase here, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which is straight out of a Daniel Pink TED Talk from 2009. Go watch that when you have 20 minutes. But basically, devs want some control over their projects. They want to be able to learn and get better and get intimate and understand all the different aspects of their project so they can have some mastery over it. And they want it to be ultimately purposeful work, right? That's contributing to the mission, that's contributing to the business's success. And they generally want to do that in an awesome way with awesome people, right? That's an easy goal. So, but devs have some qualities about them that are sort of essential for a successful reboot process. One, we do root cause analysis all the time. I hate to call it root cause analysis because it implies like a specific method and formality that we don't actually use here in our reboot, but nonetheless, we're really, really good at troubleshooting things, right? And just because we normally do that on hardware and software doesn't mean we're not able to translate those skills, at least at some level of competency, to wetware issues. So you want to harness that. And devs have an evidence-based view of the world, right? So if you have a process that's only there for process's sake, that's not actually adding anything or making anything easier, devs will call bullshit on that faster than anyone else. And you want that, right? That makes your process accelerated and makes it more efficient to get to the truth, right, that's underlying things. And of course, devs understand the tech bits, and that's what we're all here to ultimately do, is build cool tech bits. So you need to harness that as well. So your goal in engaging with your dev team is to give them as much ownership as possible of the reboot, because after all the change that comes out of the reboot is mostly going to land on their laps. So it's only fair that they get to own that and drive that as much as possible. So it's a lot about listening and understanding what their point of the view of the world is, and then going and advocating for them with your other stakeholders. Okay? The other thing that you can do for them is give visibility to the long-term org strategy. Devs are very focused individuals. They're usually head down in their projects, and oftentimes they don't have a great understanding of what the longer term, slower moving, sort of more external and ephemeral pressures are on the organization. So you can go and get that from management, you can go and understand the customers, and you can bring that back to the dev team, and that will really give them a lot of insight and perspective on how they interact with the org. Okay? So there's some specific things that we did that we found useful, right? And this is just the grab bag of ideas that you can take or leave that I'll be going through, but just some ideas. So very, very important for devs to create a safe space to talk about these things. Not that kind of safe space, but just the idea of if you try to do this in the flow of the daily work load, they're going to resent you because you're doing context switches on them all the time. So plan it out ahead, tell them it's going to happen, let them know so that they can plan for that and get all their stuff organized so that they can take, in our case, a Friday morning, twice a month, and come and gather for 2 hours and talk about wetware systems issues. And they'll feel prepared for it, and they'll feel relaxed and sort of able to focus on that problem because you've created this safe space. And then to carry on the conversation, we use HipChat. So we have a sort of an area in HipChat that's sort of designed for discussing this in an asynchronous way as time goes on and as people have thoughts. But it's separate from all the regular work. Another good thing that we did was, I call it the squishy book discussion. So we read Team Geek. Who's read Team Geek? Anyone? A couple people. You should read Team Geek. It's an interesting book, and it's a really quick read. It's 2 engineers and managers at Google talking about team dynamics issues. But it got us talking about the whole heart concept and how we were communicating with each other and all those sorts of squishy things that we don't normally talk about in the workplace. One-on-ones, right? So when you're doing a reboot and you've got dysfunction in your team, a lot of that is sensitive, and a lot of that's not going to come out in a group setting. So you should already be having one-on-ones anyway with your team, but if you're not, you especially need to be having them during a reboot, right? Because you'll hear things in a one-on-one that you'll never ever hear in a group setting. So, and that's important information too. The next group I want to talk about is management. So after the dev team, this is probably the most important group of stakeholders to go and engage and understand their perspective on what they want the state of the world to be and how they perceive the state of the world right now. But their motivations are entirely different, right? In my mind, my management is motivated on exploiting market opportunities, That doesn't mean financial in my case, but it does mean that there are research opportunities and data out there that's unexplored and unavailable, and we want to tackle that. Mitigating risks to being able to do that, and doing that in the most efficient way possible, right? These are macro concepts. It's very, very different than how devs think of the world. What management can contribute to the process is that org strategy piece, and we're going to talk a lot about that, about how critical that is to making a successful reboot. And a deep understanding of what the other areas of the company are doing, right? And that's an important input to the process as well. And not only what other areas of the org are doing, but what the industry is doing, what pressures there are, what's likely to happen to the company. They have a view that's maybe a year or two out further than the rest of the organization. So when you engage them, your goal is, one, to convince them that there are problems worthy of dedicating resources to in the dev team and with the way the dev team is interacting with the rest of the org, and pull in this big picture perspective that they offer, and then ultimately they have to sign off for change, because this kind of support for change is going to slow down your daily work for a while. It's going to take a while to renormalize and get back up to full speed. You may need to do some hiring. You may need to do some firing. You never know what's going to come out of that, but a lot of it's going to require management approval. So you've got to get them on board early in the process. Some techniques that we used for ours, just not rocket science again, just having conversations, having roundtables, but having roundtables where you ask the right kinds of questions. If you want to talk about team siloing and why that's happening, the devs will talk about it in terms of that team uses Subversion and that team uses Git. That team uses Jenkins and that team uses TeamCity. Sadly, these are all true in my environment. But for management, they don't know or care about those things. What they care about is we've got teams that are siloed doing similar things on similar projects to similar data in totally duplicative and different ways, and that's inefficient, right? So you can ask them a question like, we feel the teams are too siloed. That's one of the symptoms and themes that has come out. What are the challenges in our workplace that sort of seem to get us in this problem all the time? And they'll give you interesting insight. For us, it was, well, our funding streams are all project-based. We write a grant that says we're going to hire this person to do these things for this project over these 5 years. And when we hire researchers, they are more identified with that thing that they were hired to do than the org as a whole. And so they protect their resources to do that thing. And lo and behold, you get team silos. So it was good to have that context and be able to take that back to the dev team and say, well, look, these are the pressures that we're facing. This is why we're here. We're not just here because we made bad design decisions or bad team structures. This is actually an external pressure that's driving us this way. And so we got that kind of feedback from management. The other thing you need to get from them is the strategy piece, the vision and the end zone, what the end zone should look like. And so we had some vision interviews and perception interviews, and I'm going to show you some of the tools that we used. Ultimately, with management, what resonates is the concise communication of information, right? So very simple things, very powerful. This is one of the exercises I did. It may be the best 45 minutes I spent for the whole year of Reboot. I put all of our projects on a yearly project roadmap broken into quarters. And I put this on the table in front of my management, and I said, what do you think of this? And it saved me probably an hour or two of discussion about how we're oversubscribed and how we're too fractured and how we're not focused on our core mission. Because my director looked at that and said, Q2, there's like 26 initiatives going on concurrently. How many people do we have in IT? 12? We've got a problem, right? Simple, visual, mind-numbing, not rocket science, but no one had thought to do it in this way. So it really resonated with management, and we've used that diagram a lot. Another one was we drew this picture collaboratively with management. What do you want our product to look like? Or what do you want us to look like in 3 years? And we collaboratively came up with this picture. And the elements of the picture are not that important, just that, this is the thing that we want to build in 3 or 5 years. We want to look like that, right? And I can't tell you the number of times I've drawn this picture on the whiteboard, which again saved me hours and hours of dialogue about where we were trying to go. So concise communication of information. Are there simple tools that you guys can use to illustrate the problems that you have in your workplace? For us, the problem is we have vertical teams. We're trying to build horizontal consistency here with a consolidated data store and an API that works across all of our data. There's a fundamental disconnect in alignment there, and we need to talk about how we're going to traverse that. So it'll be different for you, but can you put tools together to get you there? Engaging the customer. Customers are ones that sometimes get overlooked, but they're actually very insightful. They have very simple goals. They want you to help them solve their problems, and they want to know how you're going to do it and see you doing it along the way, right? Transparency. But what they can contribute is, what's important for us to go build? What does the world want? Oftentimes we forget to ask that question. And so if you can ask that question, you'll get good insight. And also, they have less skin in the game, so they'll be honest with you. Yeah, your team's communication sucks. You know, the way that you communicate workflow is really not intuitive at all. Or, you know, they'll tell you exactly what's wrong. So your goals with the customer are bring them closer into the team, make them an active participant on a regular basis so that you can get feedback as to is what we're trying to do with this reboot really going to address the ultimate needs of the customer. It help them help you prioritize your organization. Okay, a lot of times management thinks they know best. It's really the customers that know best, and they really need to give that input into management. And of course, you want to make customers happy, right? Because that keeps us employed. So some of the things we did, again, roundtables, nothing magic here. Retrospectives after every major release, that's a really important thing that a lot of time gets scrapped because we're rushed and we need to get started on the next iteration. But make sure you take the time to do your retrospectives and actually act on what you hear. The worst thing you can do is have one and then don't do anything about it. But make sure that you actually follow through with that. But one of the simple things we did was we mapped out our communications flow with our customers. And again, our customers are our researchers, so we work with them every day. And it turns out our communications map looked like this. And that's a huge single point of failure. And we kind of intuitively knew that, but it was really, really good to put it on paper, right? Saved a lot of conversation, saved a lot of debate. We have a single point of failure. No one can really deny that. Now, this was put in place for a good reason, because before we had this model, we had really inconsistent communication, so we thought we were doing the right thing here, and I'll talk about unintended consequences at the end of the talk. But anyway, having that visual really helped get us to a root cause problem. So if you're exploring the theme of something always seems to be on fire, you'll get different insight from the different stakeholders. In our case, the dev team said, we get a lot of requests that are sort of for secondary projects that don't seem that important, but pull us away from our core projects. And management says, well, yeah, we do that because the campus has lots of demographic researchers. We're the experts for that on campus, and we want to help them. And you know, exploring that further, it turns out that we want to help them doesn't get balanced with, but we want to vet their requests and make sure they're aligned with our core mission and that it really makes sense for us to be helping them. And the customers are just like, yeah, everybody told me to go to you for help with my demographic research. You agreed to do my research website. It's been 6 months. Every time I call over there, something more pressing is happening. So we're inadvertently having a bad customer effect here. So the root cause is we had a lack of focus on our mission. But until and this simplifies it greatly. You're going to iterate for a while before you get to this conclusion. But we now had all the different stakeholders building a body of evidence that says, yes, we have to focus more on our mission because we're trying to do too much. We have trouble saying no, and we're not focused enough. So we came up with some of our root causes. We had a few more than this, but I had to pare it down for time. But we had a lack of focus on our core mission. We were, as I mentioned before, poorly structurally aligned with our strategy. Our operational tools were not what they needed to be, and we needed to get better about customer dev transparency. So we've got our root causes. Now we want to get to solutions, right? So for each one of these, we collaboratively designed an action plan. And the key feature is easy wins mixed with long-term fixes, right? If you don't have the easy wins, people get bored and disillusioned with the reboot. So again, grab bag of ideas, may or may not be relevant to you. It's just to spark sort of thoughts about how you might apply this to your environment. One of the early things we did for lack of focus on mission was define the mission. I had to spend about 45 minutes on the web before I could find our mission statement. We had a problem with visibility of our mission. But our mission is to develop and disseminate research data for demographic and census researchers. What it's not is to build web app UIs. And it turns out we were a little bit too focused on the latter. We have to do that as a consequence of our mission, but it's not the primary reason we exist, which is why we need an API so that we can build different kinds of UIs. But that's a different talk. Make all the hidden work visible to management. They see features in project development. They don't see infrastructure maintenance. They don't see technical debt reduction. They don't see putting ops tools in place. Make them see all that. I put that on my roadmap as these are real things that we're working on. And then after you have all that out in the open, outsource or kill all the stuff that's not core to your mission. So we outsourced a bunch of, like if we didn't have anything unique to add to somebody's website maintenance, we outsourced that to other places on campus. Some projects we just outright killed. But we really pared down that 20-something number to a number that was much more manageable for us. I think, you know, probably right now it's around 8 things that we're trying to move forward on. Long-term work, we have to figure out how to align projects to the org vision and not vice versa. So a lot of times in higher ed, people will chase the funding, even if the funding is not really well aligned with what you do as a research center. And so we end up getting projects that don't fit well into what we're trying to build towards in that picture. And so we're working on being a little bit more selective about what it is we choose to do. And also this idea that we're working on a team structure realignment, which brings me right into this solution. So it was good to have these tools and these illustrations that sort of really made it easy to see that we had vertical silos, but we needed to do a lot of dev in the horizontal direction. And so the first thing that illustrated that was that product component document. But one of the things that allowed us to do was to make some early hires that weren't buried in projects. We found some money that we could allocate to hire some people to start thinking about APIs across projects and metadata management across projects. So that was an early win we had. We have a couple of guys that are doing that now and starting to lay the groundwork for this thing we have to build. How many of you know what Conway's Law is? So Conway's Law is organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs that are copies of the communication structure of the org itself. Somebody, I forget who said it, but if you have an organization that has 4 teams and you build a compiler, you'll get a 4-pass compiler, right? So, but there's a lot of truth to this. It's sort of persisted for 40-something years now. So if you're trying to build this, align your team to that, right? I mean, it sounds easy, it's hard to do, but I mean, it's a good guiding principle. So we're having a lot of conversation about how do we do that? Do we take our vertical teams and turn them horizontally? The entire internet tells us that's a horrible idea. You should have cross-functional teams that can solve problems without dependencies across tiers. But actually in our environment, it kind of makes sense to do that. And the dependency across tiers is only going to persist so long as we don't design a good API to break those dependencies apart. So it will be a forcing function. So that's one way we could go. And we're having conversations about other ways that we can attack that problem as well. But the point is, have the thing you're trying to build and try to align your organization to it. So operational deficits, this is a great one for doing a reboot because this is right in the wheelhouse of dev teams. This will get them excited about doing a reboot because they want this kind of change. They want the awesome one-push deployment. They want the nirvana of work tracking tools, and so they'll dive right into this. So it's easy to get early wins when you have operational deficits, as long as you can convince management to give you the breathing space to go ahead and do them. So we've been working on moving everything over to Git and everything over to Jenkins, and we're doing a lot with Chef and Vagrant now to automate more of the provisioning of the bits and pieces that we need to do development. And the key piece that enabled all this is that we went to management and said, we want 20% time. And they said, you want to do whatever you want on Fridays like Google does? I said, no, we want 20% of every quarter to kill technical debt. And because of these conversations and this groundwork that we had laid, they actually signed off on that without much pushback. They even sent out an email that said, dear researchers, during your next quarterly planning meeting, please be aware that we will be reserving 20% of the developer's time for technical debt reduction indefinitely moving forward. And it's been a year now, and we're still doing that. So that's been fantastic, and it's given us the breathing time to do all these other things that we've been working on. Another thing that we did was put HipChat in place. It sounds simple. It's a persistent group chat tool if you don't know what it is. But you can hook that into all of your ops systems and your status systems and your build systems, and we're doing that, and it is creating a much richer flow of communication about what's happening in the team among our group. So simple but very powerful. Long term, we've got a long list of technical debt that we're going to go kill. Another thing that we're doing is we designed a system monitoring API, and we published the specs to all of our project teams and said, we would like for you to work this API into your products over the next 2 quarters. And so we're starting to build these operational hooks that are going to give us allow us to level up on our sophistication on our ops tools and give us a platform to build from in terms of getting more sophisticated with that. The last one I'm going to talk about today is lack of customer developer transparency. So early wins here were the formalization of a quarterly planning process. And it's formal only in the lightest sense, but everybody understands what they need to bring to the table, and everybody understands what's going to come out of that, which is namely, we're going to move a bunch of tickets around in our Redmine work tracking system, we're going to put some priorities on them, and at the quarterly granularity, the researchers are satisfied for the most part, and then we go and then break those into shorter iterations and work units that make sense. But the other thing we did was we opened Redmine to our customers so that if they wanted to engage more deeply, if they wanted to get involved in iteration planning, they could, and they do, and some of them do and some of them don't. But the fact of the matter is I can point them to that and say we have total transparency as to how we're developing your project, and if you want to participate, you can participate at whatever level you can, and it's not read-only participation. You can get in there, reopen tickets, you can even close tickets. That was a scary one, allowing our customers to close tickets for us, but it actually turns out to be pretty useful in certain circumstances. So we try to be as open as we can with that. Now long term, we're refactoring our comm model with our customers. I showed you the picture of what it used to look like. This is my best estimation of what it looks like now. It's scary as hell from a management point of view that something's going to come through one of those back doors and commit us to something very big or very scary or sort of derail us. That's my problem with communicating to my devs how to appropriately use these comm channels, but I don't want to control these comm channels. So you notice we have a lot more connections across that barrier, a lot more bandwidth, and no single point of failure. And it's a little more chaotic, it's a lot more chaotic, but it's also more effective. Things are happening faster. I'm no longer a roadblock. I wasn't the program manager before, but that person actually left the organization. And it gave us the impetus for actually breaking this apart a little bit more. And so now, actually, you can blow out that program manager bubble, and it's even more chaotic, but it works. So at some point, you've implemented solutions, and you need to measure outcomes. And being engineers, we get really, really focused on quantitative metrics. And my caution is, that's not a bad thing, but just look for the qualitative one first. You could have all the quantitative support you want, but if people don't have that qualitative, hey, it feels better to come to work, or it feels better to work with the dev team, it doesn't matter. So look for that one. Now your quantitative indications will eventually come. Focus on the measures that are important to you. From one of the talks yesterday, do you have key performance indicators that are meaningful for you, whether it's the number of times you deploy in a week, the number of tickets you're closing, whatever the measure is, you have to evangelize with those. You have to sell those to the org that the reboot's working, that we're creating momentum, we're getting better, the change is working. So make sure that even though you know and the dev team knows it's working, you still have a sales job to do, right? So I said I was going to talk about unintended consequences as I wrap up here, and this is a cartoon that kind of illustrates the effect. Some of the things you put in place will have second-order effects that you could not have predicted because you're working with wetware, and wetware is unpredictable. So you're going to need to be prepared to iterate. So just a word of caution that this is not a one-pass system. You're going to be looping over this. Will your reboot ever be done? There might be a point in time when it feels like it's done, but you really are just transitioning to sort of a slower process of iterating over sort of the long tail of things that you're still trying to address. So the obligatory, where are we now? So we feel pretty good that management understands what it is that we do and how we do it, and it took a long time to get there. Not that they were hostile to us. They're actually very supportive of us. They do understand that without IT, the entire center would not exist, and data dissemination tools are sort of the core of what we do. But it's much more about how work flows and things like how context switches really have a massively painful effect on the team, and to try to avoid those. We feel good that, conversely, the dev team understands management's vision and management's goals and is helping them build that. And that was a little bit missing before. Everybody understands, as I was saying, the need that we need to be much more aggressive about prioritizing and focusing our efforts, and we've gotten really good at saying no to requests. And our comm patterns have changed. It's much richer. The office is sort of abuzz with conversation and the hip chat rooms, and that feels pretty good. I think we're really still working on how do we get beyond this project-specific funding model and do things holistically. It's hard because we're not paid to create a sustainable organization. We're paid to produce these projects for NSF and NIH, and they're sort of little isolated silos, and we want to make sure that we can work above that. And it's a hard problem to solve, and how do we align the staff to best support that? You know, salary is charged to projects, and so you want to make sure that they're getting their fair share while still doing things holistically. It's a particular problem, I think, in higher ed. And we're not very sophisticated yet with our ops tools, and one of the reasons I'm here, besides speaking, is to try to learn some ways that we can get that way, and we're still pretty early on that journey. Lessons learned, so the last little section here. Know who you are as an organization, and what I mean is know your history and your context of how you got to where you are, know your strengths and weaknesses, know what's constraining you, and what you can and can't do, and know what your strategy is. Okay, that's actually kind of hard to get to. But once you get there, it kind of enables the second bullet point, which is, yes, I'm there to make sure that the org is successful, but the org is made up of individual people, and I want to respect that as much as possible. One of the interesting outcomes we had was that when we became clear about who we were as an organization and I could communicate honestly to my team about that, I had 2 people say, you know what, my career development goals are not in this direction, they're in this direction, and thank you for making that clear and giving me a graceful transition to go do something else, and they did. And that's a good outcome, rather than having them fight against the system and try to make it into something it's never going to become. People are messy. Humility, respect, and trust. Heart underlies all successful org change, and that's true whether it's a reboot or not, but especially true during reboots. Assume that everyone has good intentions, right? So different perspectives, but everybody's still trying to do the right thing for the org through their filters. And you won't always be right that everyone has good intentions, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative, which is assume everybody has bad intentions. That's a bad way to go through life. It's important during reboots. We're really susceptible to hiding behind technology. I mean, especially, I'm guilty of it with hip chat. I often hip chat the guy who's 5 feet away from me, and sometimes that's appropriate. But when you're talking about sensitive wetware issues, break out of that mold and go have coffee, go have lunch, go hang out in the kitchen for a bit. It's really important. The bandwidth that you get with FaceTime is and not the Apple tool, the bandwidth that you get with honest to goodness FaceTime is really important during this kind of change. You will have resistance. And the best you can do is influence, right? You can't fix the problem directly. So you have to remember that and be humble about that. The best you can do is influence. You need to lead them to a place where they can come to the conclusion on their own that they want to invest into this change. This last bit, don't fear going against the grain. So there's all sorts of conventional wisdom about how you should do things out there. You go to a conference like this, and they say a lot of things that sound very authoritative. I'm doing it up here today. But do what's right for your org. That's a gut feeling kind of thing. But the more you know your org, the better you are at doing that. And last lesson learned. This is a good one. Now that I've spent an hour telling you how to do your reboots, avoid doing reboots if at all possible, right? You don't want to do them. They're really costly. They're really disruptive. What you want to do, if you have to do a reboot, is take what you learned during the reboot and incorporate that into your daily workflow and be much more mindful about the changes in your environment and how that's impacting your team so that you can be one of those enlightened organizations and not have to go through as painful and disruptive a process as a reboot. Okay, so thank you. That's all the time I have. I would love to continue the conversation. There's my Twitter handle. There's my email. I have a special thanks at the bottom to my collaborator who helped me put this talk together for OzCon. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and have a great rest of the day. Any questions?
So we can take some questions if you like.
Any questions?
Hey, you had a slide that said to make sure that you steer, when you're doing this reboot, you're going to steer your organization, steer everybody towards the organizational goals, not towards the projects that you're going after, right? You have this problem that researchers are just grabbing whatever projects they think they can get funded.
Uh-huh.
So there seems to be a fairly large risk there that if people are going for these projects just to get the funding, and you say we're not going to go after them, that you wouldn't actually have the funding to continue doing research at all.
So the question is, I made a point during the talk that oftentimes in higher ed research, we're guilty of chasing where the money is and not doing what we're good at or what the org's good at. And the question is, well, if you say we're not going to go after those things, then the funding dries up, then you've got nothing to do. Okay, so a couple of thoughts on that. One, we're in a very lucky position that the Minnesota Population Center is pretty much the best at doing what we do and at doing it at the scale that we do it. We don't have a problem attracting attracting money for doing historical census and demographic data development. But I'll give you a counter story that's been happening this week that's driving me nuts. The NSF put out a big proposal for doing big data and bioinformatics work, right? And the campus is all abuzz about this, and they all want to figure out how to do it and how to get the money. It's like $2 million, and it's a big deal, I guess. But we have a very well-established center at the University of Minnesota. They want to partner with us so that they can use our credibility. And our own director has said, I don't really want to do this. And yet, I've been in 3 or 4 hours of meetings with other researchers around campus on how we might partner with them to do this. Now, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the point is, that's a bit of a distraction. You know, we are not a bioinformatics organization. We are a social science organization, and we have to ask the hard questions about what it is we choose to focus on and spend our time doing, because my counter question would be, what have we missed by focusing on this proposal that we could have made better about something that was more core to our mission? So, and the other thing is, I'm an influencer. I don't get to say whether or not we do it. I just get to advocate. So we'll see if we actually keep doing that or not. Any other questions? Yeah, I mean, that's where I come back to know what it is you're trying to get to. Then you can use that as a filter to evaluate, does this there's tons of opportunities. Is this the right one to pursue? But you have to know who you are as an org and where you're trying to get. Know the market. So, some organizations do that really well, and some of them end up sort of chasing their own tails. So.